Washington, and I was born on February 23rd, 1954, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. My father's name is Benjamin F. Ford Jr., and my mother's name is Josephine Ford. My parents met in New Albany. My mother was I believe, the class valedictorian, class of 1947, and my father attended, of course, the Ford School. They met through my grandmother. My grandmother met my mom through the school, and when my father was home from school, from Alcorn, she introduced my mom to my father. Her maiden name was Millsap. My grandfather was Benjamin F. Ford, and my grandmother, we called her C.E. Ford, officially is Cornelia Eteria Ford. Although I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, I'm one of 6 children, and in the summer, most of the summers of my youth, my grandmother, we lovingly called her Mama C.E. She was the one that took care of us in the summer, and so we came, my sister and younger brother, we were in New Albany, as I mentioned, almost every year of our youth, and so we got to know a lot of friends and people here in New Albany. I never attended VF Ford. Fortunately, my grandmother lived right across from the school, and so I did have a chance, especially during spring breaks. Milwaukee spring was always a week before New Albany's school break, and so I got a chance to go into the classroom with my grandmother and the library with my aunt, Varnell. The differences that I felt were the people in New Albany seemed friendlier in terms of speaking to people that may be strangers, people that you don't even know, or just passing along on the street. And I also want to say that there was a little pressure. My grandmother and aunts and relatives never really talked about or were precocious about who my grandfather was, but they let me know that because I had the Ford name, I had to toe the line, and I had to be a good character. And if I saw anyone, I had to speak to them. That's not something that we had to do when I was living in Milwaukee. So there was a little pressure there. One day, my sister and brother and I were outside playing, and we got into a little scrap. And my grandmother let us know that was not allowed. And so I think that was the very first, as far as I can go back in my memory. And then as I got a little bit older, I remember going to one of the Ford basketball games, and a young man was talking to me. I told him my first name, but not my last name. And one of his friends said, "Do you know who that is?" And he goes, "Yeah, her name is Gwen." And he said, "So what's the big deal?" And he said, "Well, that's the principal's niece." And the young man said, "Well, oops," and he left. So I think that just told me, well, there must be some difference being attached to the Ford name. My father was the second oldest. My aunt Inez Ford was a previous principal of Ford School as well as a librarian. She was the oldest, and then it was my father, and then there was a sister who died during nursing school. Her name was Vivian, and then my aunt Varnell. He was the only boy in the family. He didn't actually talk a lot about him in terms of the pressures, but he did say that he always said he had a very good father, and his father was kind, and he mentioned how his father was very helpful in terms of helping other people. And I think that spirit spilled over to my father because growing up, I just remember my parents always opening up their home to people. I remember when my grandmother on my mother's side needed a place to live, and she had 4 children. Her husband died, and they lived near Tupelo, Mississippi. They came to live with us in Wisconsin, and so my father had his 6 children and his 4, I guess they would be considered his, let's see, not stepsons, but, well, I guess they would be his in-laws, but they were so much younger than he, so I always get kind of mixed up because they were the second family from my grandmother's second marriage, and so I always get mixed up because I had an uncle that was actually a year younger than me. But anyway, we all lived together, and my father, went to work and took care of everybody. So I think that spirit of giving, and then just throughout all my years of living, I just remember my parents working at food pantries, and when we went off to college, always inviting our friends to come and stay with us during the holidays. I believe my father left New Albany, it was probably in 1952. It was after his father passed. My oldest 3 brothers were all born in New Albany. So I, as the 4th child, was the first one in 1954 that was born in Wisconsin. So my best recollection would be that they, sometime between maybe 1952 and 54, because my 3rd brother was born in 52, and he was born here in New Albany. I think my parents were part of that great migration where there was work. There were lots of industry in the Midwest, and that was the main reason my parents moved, was because of the working opportunities. He went to Alcorn. My aunt, 2 of my aunts, Varnell and Inez, went to Alcorn as well. And my father was at Alcorn, and my grandfather asked my father if he would help finance and pay for their schooling. And then my grandfather, after my father would help them go through school, he said that he would then help my father. And so it's just, the spirit of giving was ingrained in him, I think, from his father for a long time. When he went north, he was an auto mechanic, and after years of being with a larger company, he eventually was promoted to a corporate level. It's a managerial level. After going through the Milwaukee public school system, I attended college at UW, University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and then I started working for an investment firm, Merrill Lynch, and I became actually the first African-American female stockbroker in Wisconsin for, let's see, that would have been about 1980. And I don't know if it's for sure, but I think that spirit of being a pioneer or, a trailblazer, it was just maybe something I picked up from my grandfather, just knowing about him and knowing what he did. Sometimes, even though I didn't get to know him because he died before I was born, just that spirit and feeling like you can do things, and that spirit of being a pioneer, or that spirit of trailblazing, I think it was just probably ingrained in me, because I always felt proud of who my grandfather was. And again, my family was not very precocious about what he did or what he accomplished, or the fact that the school was named after him, but I do recall one day when I was visiting with my grandmother, and I was getting a little bit older, and she pulled me aside and she said, "I want to show you something." And she pulled a box from her closet, and she had a lot of news clippings and papers, and she handed me a pamphlet, and it was called something like Publication for Colored Educators. And she showed me an article. She said, "I want you to read this. This is about your grandfather." Milwaukee's system was pretty much neighborhood schools. And so wherever you lived, that was the neighborhood that you would go to. And in the early 60s, there was a lot of segregation. And so my school had predominantly not only black students, but also teachers. And I recalled when I was in the 3rd grade, I was struggling with my math, and my teacher said, "I know you can do better because I know your parents. I went to school with your father at Alcorn." And I'm like, oh my goodness. And so I went home and I asked my parents, did they know my teacher? And my dad's like, "Oh yeah, sure, I know her. We went to school together." I thought, uh-oh, I guess I better do better. So no matter where you are, the pressure's on. And but the schools were segregated. I do recall, because there was fair housing laws that were not passed at the time, but because of the segregation, I do recall an attempt to integrate, and remember being bused to an all-white school, just my class and other, classes, but it wasn't a true integration. It was like I was still in the same classroom with the students from my school. I just didn't get it, but but anyway, we got on the bus, and that happened for a little while. Then when I was maybe in middle school, I did go to a predominantly white school. And then for high school, I was at a predominantly black school, but there were still, some white students. So as neighborhoods changed, then the makeup of the school, the racial makeup of the school also changed. The busing, oh yeah, that was very difficult. And like I said, it was one of these confusing things because it just didn't make sense. Why should I be pulled out of my school, going to another school, and then sitting in the classroom with the same students? And when I was in high school, my parents moved to a neighborhood that there was a mixture of races, and our next door neighbors were white, and some of the friends that I had were white, and so we all seemed to get along pretty well, at least for my generation. I had sleepovers, and I slept over at their home, and so I think that I was at that age where I knew that there were things that were based on who you were in terms of your race, and I know there were some restrictions. But I didn't really actually feel a restriction until I was actually here in New Albany when I was younger. So I do want to talk about that experience a little bit. And I think it was because it was like the early 60s. It was before the Civil Rights Act, and there was probably Jim Crow laws in place. But my sister and I were old enough, and our grandmother let us walk to the downtown area of New Albany, and we went into I think it was called like a ice cream parlor. I don't remember the exact name of it, but because I was from Milwaukee, where there was, you could go wherever you wanted to go, we just went in and we asked for something, and we sat down, and the server said, "You can't sit there." She said, "Sorry, you can't sit there." And that was a shock because I had never experienced that before, and I wasn't quite old enough to understand, and nobody had ever explained to us that there was a difference in terms of where you could go and what stores you could go into and things like that. And so we ended up just, I think there was a black man, older man, around the corner, behind a curtain somewhere. They appeared and just said, "Come on back here with us, don't make any trouble." And then it just clicked for me. Oh, so we, because of who we are, the color of our skin, we have to go back there. So we were a little bit belligerent. I think my sister and I just kind of shoved the ice cream over the counter, kind of like, well, forget it. We won't stay. If we can't sit here, then we don't want the ice cream. And we left. Well, lo and behold, we got home and we told our father and grandmother about what happened, and they were, "Oh my goodness, what did you do?" And we said, "Well, we just wanted some ice cream, but they wouldn't let us sit down." And so then they kind of explained to us, "Well, don't do that again." And so it was a little, I was a little saddened about that, because all my other experiences up until that point had been so positive, carefree, and no restrictions that I knew of. I was in the bubble. Yes, exactly. And I was in, and then because my aunt, I think she was maybe assistant superintendent of schools, or somehow she had, whenever we had interactions with anyone that was white, it was always very positive. And so I was pretty much in, as you say, the bubble. And in Wisconsin, it was like somewhat of a bubble, except for the segregation. And even that did not feel like a bubble for me, because we could still go downtown, go to any store that we wanted to, try on clothes, do anything we wanted to do. And so I think to that extent, that was a major difference that I felt I experienced between living in Wisconsin and coming to New Albany in the earlier days. I think it improved eventually. I do recall another instance where I was with my cousins, and we went to a movie, and at the movie theater we went upstairs, and I didn't even realize that we went upstairs because we had to. I just thought, boy, is this great, what a neat view from up high. And then it was only later that I found out, well, you were upstairs because you couldn't be on the main floor. So again, that was just my lack of understanding the Jim Crow laws. But eventually, as I got older, and integration took place. So I was around, and I do recall when V.F. Ford School became the elementary school, again, all elementary, and that there was integration. I remember going to W.P. Daniels with my aunt Varnell, and I remember when I was a stockbroker, I came back to visit, and my aunt had me attend one of the classes to do a presentation about investments to her students. And I remember looking at the students and how there were both black and white students in the school. And then of course, as I got older, when I would go to, I think the store was called Two Sisters, I could try on clothes, I could do whatever, there were no restrictions. And so I do remember feeling that change that did take place eventually. The history of African Americans, I'm young enough, or I should say, first of all, I'm old enough to remember some of the changes. But when I was young, I do remember, and maybe this is a spillover from my grandfather, and that's all I can think, because my father, I believe, was molded by his parents. But I do remember my father explaining to me one day, he said, as you read a lot of the history, understand it do not allow the history to hold you back. And a lot of things that happened, the atrocities, understand it was that way, but a lot of the people that you meet on a day-to-day basis were not part of that. So do not allow that to bitter you. Be proud of who you are. Be proud of yourself as an African American, but do not allow the atrocities, the history, to form a bitter heart. And my parents were Christians, and so they taught us to not judge other people, and yet to if people were not in terms of their income, maybe from the same socioeconomic background, do not look down on them. And if people were of more wealth than we are, do not hold them up as idols, or they're people. He said they are people. Try to treat people, the golden rule, as you would want to be treated. And I think that really helped me throughout my life, throughout my career, throughout my schooling. So thank you, grandfather. I was married in 1978 to a wonderful man, and he and I met in college in Wisconsin. We were married for about 5 years and started a family. I have a son, Christopher. Dansby was my married last name. I always kept Ford as my middle name. And I have a daughter. So my son was born in 1982. So he'll be 40 this year. And my daughter was born in 1986. I keep saying she's 27 because I want to stay younger. But the two of them are very close in terms of they're the only brother and sister. And my first husband passed away from cancer, and about 12 years later, I remarried, and again, just blessed with being married to a wonderful man, and that's how I got the last name Washington. Whenever I come, I always think, what would it be like, or wouldn't it be nice if I lived here? It's just a beautiful town, and like I said, the hospitality of the people, black and white, is not something that I see everywhere, and so it's not out of the realm of possibilities. The neighborhood, the people that were living on Washington, I think we called it Washington Avenue at the time, it's now Oak Street. I played with them, and everybody seemed to know. All the adults knew all the children, and that was actually, I felt, protected. I felt like I was watched over, so nothing bad was going to happen to me, because there were all these other parents in our lives. And I remember playing on the playground with the children, other children. I remember going to the park, the swimming pool. There was a swimming pool in the park, and down the street or down the hill from the Via Ford School. So I remember that. I have really good memories of the neighborhood. And I also remember there was stores, a motel, barbershop, someone that owned the funeral home. I remember a number of people that were in business, and I remember going to those shops and places. I haven't kept up with any of them, but yesterday at the unveiling of the historical marker, a number of friends came up to me and I actually remembered a few of them. So, yeah, and we just talked about some of our fun days. And that was a little different experience too, because in Wisconsin I attended a United Methodist Church. And then when I was here, I attended, oh no, I don't, it's a missionary Baptist church. Is it a Watson's?
Watson Grove.
Watson Grove, yes, a missionary Baptist church. And my grandmother sang in the choir. And it was a different type of service. And I loved the songs. They were more gospel songs. And I think where I was in Wisconsin, there were more like hymns. And so there was a difference in music, and I enjoyed the gospel, more of the gospel singing. And, but it frightened me sometimes with the minister, because I hadn't seen ministers that were so dramatic. And I remember my grandmother would have to explain to me when we got home. She said, "That's nothing to be frightened of." I said, "Well, it seemed like he got possessed or something." And I said, and this lady stood up and she was shouting, and what's going on? So now I'm laughing now, because I look back at it, it was nothing to be, afraid of. But it was just, again, very different. I think because I had that experience, it also helped me with having appreciation for different religions. My son drove from Wisconsin. He surprised me. I didn't think that anyone from Wisconsin, of any of my siblings or relatives from Wisconsin, would be able to come. And so I was very surprised when he showed up. He drove all night to be here for the marker. And he's here now. He's actually in the museum, walking around right now. But Christopher, it was just amazing. He surprised me. And my daughter, Nicole, is an Army family, and they're living in Hawaii, so she could not be here today as well. But if she were in Wisconsin, she would have been here.